The circumstances of Elizabeth's birth would dictate the first quarter of a century of her life. Her parents had hoped for a son to provide Henry VIII with a long-desired legitimate male heir to continue the Tudor line and prevent any fallback into the civil wars which had characterized English politics in the 15th century. Thus, while Elizabeth's birth was celebrated, and she was promptly proclaimed Henry's heir presumptive, jumping past her half-sister Mary, born of Henry's first marriage to Catherine of Aragon, there was no denying that Henry and Anne were disappointed not to have had a boy. This desire for a male heir had characterized Henry VIII's reign since the mid-1520s and had resulted in his long-running quest for a legal divorce from his first wife between 1527 and 1533. Nevertheless, when a daughter arrived in 1533, the king and queen made the best of it and claimed that a boy would soon follow. Meanwhile, in December 1533, the 3-month-old Princess Elizabeth was established in her own royal household at Hatfield, staffed by numerous servants and a group of guardians handpicked by her mother. Most of Elizabeth's closest attendants were extended Boleyn relatives. Though she was only a baby, Elizabeth was a chess piece in the English politics of the 1530s. Before long, her father's patience with her mother began to wear thin, as Anne suffered multiple miscarriages in the mid-1530s, and the son she had promised the king never arrived. In May 1536, after a series of outlandish claims, including the suggestion that Anne had been in an incestuous relationship with her own brother, emerged, Anne was executed for charges of adultery, incest, and treason. The charges were probably fabricated as a means for Henry to dispense of his second wife. Not long thereafter, the Boleyn marriage was annulled on the basis that Henry had been seduced into it by some form of witchcraft. This rendered Elizabeth illegitimate, and within 2 weeks of Anne's death, Henry was married to his third wife, Jane Seymour. He soon ceased supporting Elizabeth's household in the fashion that he previously had. Then, in July of 1536, the English Parliament passed the Succession Act, which stated that Henry's marriage to Anne Boleyn had been invalid, officially rendering Elizabeth illegitimate. Henry had always demonstrated an attachment to his eldest daughter, Mary, born in 1516 from his marriage to Catherine of Aragon, and he had been quick to welcome her back into the fold in the 1530s, once she agreed to end her obstinate refusal to acknowledge Henry's divorce of her mother. The king did not immediately make such an effort for his younger daughter, and continued to keep her at arm's length in the years following her mother's execution. Indeed, Elizabeth's governess, Lady Margaret Bryan, was soon writing to Thomas Cromwell, Henry's chief minister, begging him to intercede with the king on the child's behalf. In her letter, Lady Bryan wrote that Elizabeth was growing out of her clothes quickly, and there were insufficient resources to keep her in a manner befitting a daughter of the king, legitimate or illegitimate. Such were the financial straits at Hatfield that 2 members of Elizabeth's household were even charged for poaching deer in the parklands surrounding the house. The birth in October 1537 of Prince Edward, Henry's first legitimate male heir, changed matters, though it resulted in the death 2 weeks later of Jane Seymour, Henry's third wife, owing to postnatal complications. With a male heir now in place, Elizabeth and Mary were reintegrated back into the Horatian court more fully, their positions as either legitimate or illegitimate being somewhat nullified when there was now a male successor to the throne. Moreover, before her death, and while she was pregnant, Jane had encouraged the king to restore Elizabeth to a better position. The belated manner in which Henry accepted Elizabeth into the royal household contrasted sharply with her character. Of all his children, Elizabeth would prove to be the most like her father. She resembled Henry, with the same light, reddish hair, pale skin, and ruddy cheeks, though with her mother Anne's brown eyes. She would also prove herself in years to come to have the same hard-headedness of her father. Elizabeth received a very good education in the late 1530s and throughout the 1540s, and soon proved to be one of the most brilliantly learned women in 16th century Europe. She spoke 5 languages: English, French, Spanish, Italian, and Latin, and could read Greek and Dutch to some extent. When an Irish aristocrat visiting court many years later wanted to gain her attention, he presented her with a small dictionary of key phrases in the Irish language. Her scholarly work involved translating ancient Latin text, such as Boethius's The Consolation of Philosophy and Tacitus's Annals. As she was being educated in the 1540s, she grew closer to her younger brother, Prince Edward, who was much closer in age to her than was Mary. Elizabeth carried the chrism at Edward's baptism. They shared some of the same tutors in the years that followed, and they were both influenced by the same ardently Protestant reformers at the Henrican court. During her early years, Elizabeth found surrogate mothers in her governesses and in a succession of stepmothers. The Protestant German princess Anne of Cleves, whom Henry married when Elizabeth was 6 years old, took an interest in Henry's youngest daughter. Her marriage to Henry lasted only a few months before he acquired an annulment, but Anne and Elizabeth continued to visit and write to each other following the divorce. She did not develop a close relationship with her father's 5th wife, Catherine Howard, a niece of the Duke of Norfolk, who wed Henry when she was 17 years old in 1540. She was dead not much over a year and a half later, after committing adultery with a courtier by the name of Thomas Culpeper. When this latest stepmother was executed, Elizabeth drew an important lesson from it. The princess, no doubt remembering what had happened to her mother as well, remarked to her childhood friend Robert Dudley, "I shall never marry." This lesson would be reinforced over and over again as Elizabeth grew up, and she observed that married women were invariably at the mercy of their husbands, surrendering power and self-determination to them. Henry's 6th wife, Catherine Parr, whom Henry married when Elizabeth was 9 years old, was also kind and motherly towards her. Catherine, who authored several books herself, recognized the young princess's intellectual potential and encouraged her in her academic pursuits. Catherine is also usually credited with persuading Henry to restore both Mary and Elizabeth to the line of succession to the throne, after their younger brother Edward. Beyond these stepmothers, it was the serving members of Elizabeth's household, most of whom were extended relations of her mother, Anne Boleyn, with whom Elizabeth developed the closest relationships, particularly her beloved governess, Catherine "Cat" Ashley, who would remain with Elizabeth as lady-in-waiting when she became queen many years later, while William Cecil, a rising official esteemed for his intelligence and abilities, served in his younger years as the surveyor of Elizabeth's household. Elizabeth was 13 years old when her father died in January 1547. It must have been a difficult event full of conflicting emotions for a girl who by then was old enough to know that her father had sanctioned the execution of her mother. Henry was generous to his daughters in his will, allowing each of them an annual income of £3,000. With Henry's death, 9-year-old Edward became King Edward VI. A regency council was appointed to govern for him during his childhood years. This was first headed by his uncle, Edward Seymour, who became Lord Protector of England and the Duke of Somerset. The Dowager Queen, Catherine Parr, invited Elizabeth to live with her and her new husband, Thomas Seymour, Somerset's brother, whom Catherine had married within months of the king's death, something which many people disapproved of. Elizabeth's experiences here were less than ideal. Thomas Seymour was an unscrupulous man, constantly in pursuit of greater power. Clearly, his marriage to Catherine had not fully satisfied his ambitions, and he began to engage in highly inappropriate behavior towards Elizabeth once she was ensconced in their household. He frequently visited her bedchamber in the early mornings, still in his nightgown, sitting on her bed uninvited and tickling her. Elizabeth began to get up earlier in the mornings, ensuring that her maids attended her as early as possible to avoid Seymour's visits. It must have been enormously confusing to her when her stepmother, rather than confront her husband about his behavior, began to participate in the peculiar horseplay. This leaves us with many questions and, if true, it is a damning indictment of both Seymour and Parr. Did Catherine believe that her husband's behavior towards her stepdaughter was in fact innocent and all in fun? Was she jealous or insecure and seeking to keep herself involved in her husband's activities? Whatever Catherine's beliefs and motives were, she promptly sent Elizabeth away in May 1548, when she unexpectedly discovered her husband and 15-year-old stepdaughter, quote, in an embrace. To give Catherine the benefit of the doubt, she may very well have sent Elizabeth away to protect her, while she was seemingly unable to control her husband's behavior. After being sent away, Elizabeth never saw her stepmother again. The two exchanged a few letters after Elizabeth's departure, but Catherine Parr died as a result of complications from childbirth less than 4 months later. Unfortunately, Elizabeth had not heard the last of Thomas Seymour. With Catherine dead, he began actively pursuing Elizabeth's hand in marriage. It is difficult to determine how Elizabeth felt about this. Seymour was around 40 years old at the time, whereas she was 15. But such age differences were not entirely unusual in early modern times when it came to organizing political marriages. And a marriage between one of the king's uncles and his half-sister would most certainly be a political match were it to occur. What foiled Seymour's plan was that he acted in secret, and when details of what he was conspiring towards became public, it had the look of a political conspiracy by him. When it was revealed, the Privy Council had him detained and questioned. Elizabeth was interrogated closely about the Seymour plot, but she adamantly denied any involvement on her part in any plans or schemes of which King Edward or the Privy Council did not approve, including any question of marriage. The Seymour episode eventually blew over. Elizabeth likely learned a great deal from it. For the next 2 years, she passed most of her time at Hatfield, immersed in her studies, and wrote regularly and dutifully to her brother, King Edward. She began to visit court more regularly, beginning in or around 1551. There she became the very model of the virtuous princess, dressing with modesty and little ostentation. Elizabeth was Protestant in her religious leanings, though she was much more moderate than her brother the king. Edward was emerging as a Calvinist monarch and had overseen the adoption of a radical form of Protestantism in the late 1540s and early 1550s. Elizabeth, conversely, favored some doctrinal elements of Protestantism, but still admired the pomp and ceremony of Roman Catholicism. As with so much else, she was much like her father in that regard. In the early summer of 1553, with Edward profoundly ill, Elizabeth was warned by William Cecil that the king was dying and that there was a plot afoot to imprison both herself and her half-sister Mary and place Lady Jane Grey, a great-granddaughter of Henry VII, on the throne as a Protestant stooge controlled by the Duke of Northumberland, who had emerged as the foremost figure in Edward's government in the early 1550s. When Edward VI died on the 6th of July, 1553, possibly from tuberculosis, Lady Jane Grey was proclaimed queen. However, Elizabeth mourned her brother's passing. Edward's attempt to defy their father's will and remove both Mary and Elizabeth from the line of succession rankled her. Thus, when the Privy Council proclaimed Mary as queen, in defiance of Northumberland's efforts to make Lady Jane Grey queen, Elizabeth promptly wrote to Mary to signal her support for her cause, despite Mary's well-known zealous Roman see. Elizabeth accompanied the new queen as she progressed triumphantly into London in August of 1553, the Grey cause having collapsed almost immediately. Mary's reign would prove tumultuous for Elizabeth. As a Protestant and Mary's heir, she was a figurehead for those English people who would rather see a Protestant on the throne. Accordingly, even in instances where she did not encourage it, she was made a figurehead of opposition to the Marian regime. Most dangerously, in the case of the rebellion in early 1554 of Thomas Wyatt, an insurrection which Elizabeth had nothing to do with, but nevertheless led to her being detained in the Tower of London for some time. Throughout these unsettling years, Elizabeth could never be certain that her life was secure, and she cleaved ever closer to the serving members of her household, whom she considered her family. These included the Ashleys, the Sheltons, and William Cecil. She also grew closer during these years to her friend Robert Dudley, whom she referred to affectionately as Sweet Robin. Robert was a son of John Dudley, Duke of Northumberland, whom Queen Mary had executed for his part in the plot to raise Lady Jane Grey to the throne. The apparent closeness between the princess and Dudley was controversial. He had been married since 1550 to Amy Robsart. In April of 1555, Elizabeth's house arrest abruptly ended when Queen Mary summoned her to court. The Queen was laboring under the belief that she was expecting a child and requested that Elizabeth join her in her confinement. Elizabeth dutifully attended her sister in the birthing chamber throughout the summer, but Mary's due date came and went, and no baby was born. It had been a phantom pregnancy, and Elizabeth remained the heir to the throne. In the aftermath of this incident, Mary invited Elizabeth to remain at court, giving her chambers befitting her position, and allowing her more and more freedom as time went on. It is possible that Mary's conduct in this matter indicated some renewal of sisterly feeling between the two women. However, Mary may also have invited Elizabeth to remain at court simply to keep a closer eye on her. Elizabeth remained at Hatfield for the next 2 years. During this time, she and Robert Dudley became closer than ever. He visited her often, and they enjoyed many of the same pursuits, including riding, hunting, dancing, playing at cards, and witty conversation. Elizabeth and Robert seemed not to care about the implications of their relationship when in each other's company, and there was little Elizabeth's advisors, such as William Cecil, could say to dissuade her. Elizabeth endured 2 years of tension and uncertainty after her return to Hatfield. Then matters changed very dramatically. On the 17th of November, 1558, her sister Mary died, most likely of ovarian or uterine cancer, a likely explanation for some of the symptoms accompanying her phantom pregnancies. Lacking any other heir, Elizabeth, the last of the children of Henry VIII, was promptly proclaimed as Queen Elizabeth I of England. It was not immediately apparent whether Elizabeth intended to rule as a Protestant or a Catholic monarch. For her part, Elizabeth was content that this ambiguity should last as long as possible until she could consolidate her power and establish a government. She well understood that England was still heavily Catholic, as were many of the nobles and clergy around her. Nearly 2 decades of separation from Rome had rendered many English ambivalent about papal supremacy, even those who considered themselves to be loyal Catholics. The English Parliament thus proved willing to grant Elizabeth the title of Supreme Governor of the Church of England, without really knowing what the Queen's wider religious stance was. The Elizabethan religious settlement would only unfold in the course of 1559 and 1560. Elizabeth understood that she had to proceed carefully while her reign was still new and uncertain. Queen Mary's body lay in state at St. James Palace until mid-December, with regular Catholic vigils performed until her interment at W. Elizabeth continued to have the Latin Mass celebrated in her private chapel, but demonstrated her discomfort with Catholicism in other small ways, such as requesting removal of specifically Catholic rituals, such as the raising of the host during Mass. Elizabeth ensured that her sister's funeral was both magnificent and in keeping with Catholic tradition, although she did imprison a eulogizing priest following it for vaguely referring to her supposed illegitimacy. On the day of her coronation, the 15th of January, 1559, Elizabeth processed through the city of London as the people cheered her joyfully. She was anointed and crowned Queen of England and Ireland in Westminster Abbey, entering the church dressed in magnificent royal robes of gold, trimmed with ermine and jewels, her long red hair loose and flowing. As Elizabeth passed by, attendees promptly cut off pieces of the blue carpet upon which she walked as souvenirs. Ever conscious of how controversial her Protestant faith still was to many of her subjects, Elizabeth's coronation was a largely Catholic service. Even within a largely Catholic ceremony, Elizabeth did not prostrate herself for the anointing. Instead, she simply knelt in a dignified fashion. Moreover, as soon as the Latin Mass began, the Queen promptly withdrew to a private chamber to change her costume for the upcoming feast and celebration. This was clearly designed as a public statement of her rejection of some of the Catholic rites, carefully choreographed to indicate to the political nation that further religious changes would come in the months ahead. Emerging in an exquisite costume of purple and ermine, she headed the procession out of the church. Smiling and graciously greeting members of the cheering crowd, Elizabeth had cleverly managed to have herself crowned in a way which seemed to placate both Catholics and Protestants to varying extents. One of Elizabeth's first acts as queen was what is known as the Elizabethan religious settlement. At her first official parliament, she had her government pass an Act of Uniformity which reinstated the 1549 Book of Common Prayer that had been a bedrock of her half-brother's Protestant settlement. Although a few alterations were introduced into it in line with Elizabeth's much more moderate Protestantism. One sticking point concerned the real presence of Christ's body and blood in the Eucharist, known as transubstantiation, which Catholics believed in and Protestants did not. Some historians argue that the liturgical alterations of the Elizabethan era made it possible for both Protestants and Catholics to interpret communion as they pleased. In addition, because Elizabeth was fond of the ceremony and pageantry of the Roman Catholic Church, the traditional Catholic vestments worn by priests and clerics were preserved under the new Elizabethan religious settlement, as were the images and crucifixes in churches and monasteries across England. This would become a major point of contention for more hardline Protestant reformers in England, who believed ostentation of this kind was idolatrous. Elizabeth also filled as many bishoprics and archbishoprics as possible with Protestant clerics, removing Catholic bishops appointed by Mary in the process. All in all, Elizabeth imposed a very moderate form of Lutheran Protestantism in the late 1550s and early 1560s. But it would never please a large cohort of radical Calvinists in England who became known as the Puritans and who wanted a form of Protestantism based largely on the theocracy John Calvin had created in the city of Geneva in the Swiss Confederacy back in the 1530s and 1540s. Clashes between the government and the Puritans would remain a constant feature of Elizabeth's long reign. This disagreement illustrates the level of religious discord which was prevalent, not just in England, but across Europe during the 16th century. Elizabeth's religious settlement decreed punishment for refusal to attend Sunday services or for other examples of Catholic failure to conform. But the penalties were small fines, which frequently went unenforced, depending on religious sympathies in a given region. Many Catholic clergy and the laity found it convenient to conform outwardly while inwardly retaining their own beliefs. Indeed, as Elizabeth once wisely declared, quote, "There is only one Christ, one faith. All else is a dispute over trifles." The English certainly had their religious struggles, but under Elizabeth, these struggles were considerably less violent than they proved to be elsewhere in Europe, such as in France, where the St. Bartholomew's Day massacre of 1572 would see Parisian Catholics massacre over 3,000 Protestant Huguenots in a single day. This was in the midst of 40 years of religious wars in France between the 1560s and the 1590s. Compared to this level of religious strife, England remained calm under Elizabeth, and more than a decade would pass after her accession to the throne before the religious question erupted into any form of major violence in England. England's administrative, economic, and military infrastructure all needed urgent attention. Henry VIII had spent ruinously during his reign, and neither Edward nor Mary had ruled for long enough to fully correct the problems he bequeathed to them. Conversely, wars during both Elizabeth's half-siblings' reigns and harvest failures had compounded the problem. English trade had declined as well, following the decreasing value of the English currency. Elizabeth worked closely with her newly appointed Secretary of State, William Cecil, the de facto head of her government for the next 40 years, and Thomas Gresham, financier, merchant, and longtime economic advisor to the Tudors, to formulate a strategy to rescue the economy. By 1561, all of the debased currency had been withdrawn from circulation, dissolved, and replaced with freshly minted coins of gold and silver that re-established confidence in the face value of the English coinage. The recovery of England's currency helped the economy rebound nicely. Prices stabilized and trade boomed once more. In addition, Gresham founded London's Royal Exchange early in the reign, after being inspired by his direct experiences of the Antwerp Bourse, where English cloth merchants had been carrying out much of their trade in the Low Countries for decades. An island nation requires ships for both economic and military purposes. Elizabeth understood that a good deal of investment was needed in this area, yet she was still constrained by budgets. Therefore, the process of naval expansion was a careful and practical one during her reign. The ships built during Elizabeth's reign tended to be multi-purpose in design, meant for trade, exploration, fishing, and warfare. They were smaller, faster, and more maneuverable than the standard warship, and yet not so diminutive that they could not be equipped with multiple gun carriages. Several dozen were built for the royal fleet, and they were so in a semi-private manner, whereby nobles and mariners offset some of the cost by having semi-control over the ships when they were built. Ships, of course, require experienced and competent men to man them, and Elizabeth and Cecil patronized a number of highly skilled mariners from the English West Country, men like Humphrey Gilbert, Martin Frobisher, and Walter Raleigh, as well as sailors from ports like Bristol, who had decades of experience leading expeditions to the valuable fisheries off the Grand Banks of Newfoundland in North America. Their exploration of the North American seaboard was an important, though often underappreciated, precursor to the English colonization of North America in the 17th century. England's economic recovery was impressive, and much credit is due to Elizabeth and her advisors for overseeing it, especially since regular taxation was not a strategy England could resort to, as taxes had to be approved by Parliament. Instead, a large source of funding for England's recovery came from Crown land revenues and customs duties. Due to this, Elizabeth's court was markedly less extravagant than her father's. She kept her staff and that of the Privy Council, the main governing body of the realm, small, installing most of the members of her traditional household in positions at court. Entertainments and banquets in the early years were elegant, but not overly extravagant. Indeed, such was the manner in which Elizabeth was determined to put the state's finances on a better footing than had been seen since the days of her grandfather, King Henry VII, that she became notorious for her parsimony and unwillingness to spend excessive amounts of money on grand projects. In the long run, this was a judicious policy for the most part, and despite its limited resources, the English government accomplished quite a lot during the Elizabethan era. However, it frequently infuriated her counselors, who viewed the Queen as a ruler who constantly changed her mind on policy matters, often based on her concerns about expenditure. There was one particular area where Elizabeth could not avoid spending money. This was in Ireland. When she came to the throne in 1558, Elizabeth also became Queen of Ireland. Yet the island remained only partially under English control. Dozens of largely independent Irish lords ruled different parts of the country, whereas English rule was largely confined to Dublin and the Pale, which surrounded it in Leinster. A program of regional conquest and colonization had been entered into towards the end of her father's reign and would play out for decades during Elizabeth's reign. Initially, the weaknesses of Elizabeth's government were plain for all to see, as Shane O'Neill, the head of the foremost Irish lordship in the country, the O'Neills of Ulster, raided the Pale on numerous occasions in the early 1560s. He was only finally defeated in 1567 because he overextended himself in the north of the country and was killed by his erstwhile allies, the MacDonalds of Western Scotland. Further wars and plantations occurred consistently through the 1570s and 1580s, gradually reducing the Irish lords, though at a large cost to Elizabeth's exchequer, much to her dismay. Because Elizabeth was young, unmarried, and childless, the question of her marriage was intensely debated all throughout the 1560s and 1570s. England needed an heir. Unlike Edward and Mary before her, there was no sibling waiting to step into the breach and succeed her if Elizabeth died. Furthermore, the closest remaining heir to the English throne was Mary Stuart, Queen of Scots, a granddaughter of Margaret Tudor, Henry VIII's sister. Mary was a Catholic, and so Elizabeth and her advisors understood that the preservation of the new Protestant religious settlement in England depended on Mary, Queen of Scots, never securing the English throne. Even though she had the best claim in law to it, if Elizabeth died childless. Therefore, as soon as the reign commenced, the issue of Elizabeth's marriage arose, and suitors began to appear. However, much to the great consternation of her advisors and the political realm at large, Elizabeth seemed to only appear to be interested in Robert Dudley, who she appointed as Master of the Horse and made the Earl of Leicester several years into the reign. Elizabeth's choice not to marry became one of the defining features of her reign. In an age when marriage was seen as both a political necessity and a moral duty, Elizabeth turned convention upside down. She played the game of courtship like a master strategist, using the possibility of marriage as a diplomatic tool, stringing along European powers with the price of alliance, but never fully committing. This clever balancing act allowed her to maintain England's independence, avoiding domination by a foreign prince or entanglement in costly continental politics. At home, it reinforced her image as a ruler above personal desire, devoted solely to the crown and her people. But this decision also came at a price. Without a husband or children, Elizabeth's succession was always uncertain, and the fear of instability haunted her council. Rivals, especially Mary, Queen of Scots, loomed in the background as alternative heirs. Still, Elizabeth's charisma, political skill, and carefully cultivated myth of the Virgin Queen held the nation together. By the time of her death in 1603, Elizabeth had ruled for 45 years. She left behind no children, but she did leave a legacy: the Elizabethan Age, remembered as one of England's greatest eras of cultural flourishing, naval power, and national identity. In the end, Elizabeth proved that she didn't need a king beside her to define her reign. She was, in every sense, a monarch who ruled alone and ruled supreme.